does not come as a surprise that Scotist authors of the 17th and 18th centuries would spend time and space in their textbooks on scholastic cognitive psychology, as well as in other parts of their cursus philosophici, discussing intuitive and abstractive cognition. The distinction of these two kinds of cognition, of which the one grasps a thing as existing, whereas the other abstracts from existence, counts among the most appreciated features of John Scotus's cognition theory. It is, however, striking to find several Baroque age Scotists discuss comprehensive cognition in this particular context, and explicitly making the point that intuition is not the same thing as comprehension, since intuition, unlike comprehension, does not represent all of the formalities of an object, something that we do not, in this form, see anywhere in Scotus's works. You find a relevant quotation from Bartolomeo Mastri and Bonaventura Bellutus in the handout. Text 1. We first of all find this phenomenon in Scotist authors influenced by the two Scotist authors that I just mentioned, Bartolomeo Mastri and Bonaventura Belluto, who included two questiones on intuitive and abstractive cognition and on comprehension in their Disputationes in Aristotelis Stagirite Libros de Anima from 1643, which is a systematic account of philosophical psychology, including cognitive psychology. As for the systematic outlook of their entire cursus philosophicus, Mastri and Belluto, in their turn, are heavily indebted to Jesuit scholasticism, in particular to the development in Jesuit scholasticism around 1600 and in the following decades that moved beyond just commenting on the text of Aristotle toward giving systematic accounts of the subjects formerly dealt with, if only inadequately so, in the commentary tradition. Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza plays a crucial part in this development. The issue of my talk, the kind of cognition mentioned in the title, is well suited for illustrating this point. Indeed, if we look for a beginning of the systematic treatment of intuition, abstraction, and comprehension in Jesuit scholastic psychology, we must turn to Hurtado's Disputationes de Substantia Corporea Animata, which is his systematic account of psychology that he included in his comprehensive exposition of all of philosophy from 1615. Many a Jesuit theologian and philosopher had, of course, treated of the mentioned kinds of cognition in various philosophical and theological contexts, but without devoting entire sections of their writings to them. Hurtado does just this, namely in the 10th of his Disputationes on psychology. In the subsequent Jesuit tradition, then, it becomes standard practice to treat of intuitive, abstractive, and comprehensive cognition in cognitive psychology, in philosophical cognitive psychology. Seen from the perspective of this broad Jesuit tradition, what the aforementioned Scotists do really just is normal philosophy and nothing specifically Scotist. Given these historical circumstances, it cannot but be worthwhile to study what Hurtado has to say about abstractive, intuitive, and comprehensive cognition. As a case study of the systematization of scholastic cognitive psychology, I propose to give a close reading of Hurtado's sections on these kinds of cognition, and I will only shortly make some remarks on why Hurtado takes up his discussion of intuition and comprehension again in his work on metaphysics. Among philosophers, Hurtado observes, there is agreement on the overall understanding of what an intuitive cognition is. It is a cognition that concerns the object immediately and through its own species, and insofar as the object is existent. This is in text 2 in the handout. And this is in fact a definition that most philosophers within the intellectual horizon of our Jesuit philosopher would basically accept. When speaking of intuitive intellectual cognition, explains Hurtado, intuition is used metaphorically, since intuition properly denotes corporeal vision, in which the visual power is in contact with the proper species of an existing object. However, Hurtado goes a step further and says that, in fact, all external sensation is intuitive cognition. because it is concerned with an object as existent and by way of its own species. One may wonder whether intuition is used metaphorically when speaking of sensual cognition other than vision. It would seem that Hurtado thinks it is not, but he actually does not explain this. Instead, he begins his discussion of intuitive cognition by picking out one important issue, namely whether an intuitive sensitive cognition of an existing external object retains its intuitive character when its object disappears, not only from sight, it stops existing, presupposing that such an act may continue to exist owing to some absolute, i.e. divine power. Such an act does not seem to be intuitive any longer, since its object does not exist, and it is the mark of intuitive cognition to deal with objects as existing. On the other hand, the mere vanishing of the object does not alter the character of the act. Wherefore, Hurtado says that this act actually is no longer intuitive, though it still has the nature of an intuitive act, since it is concerned with an existing object that just no longer exists. And by this, it differs from an act of abstractive cognition, Hurtado suggests. An intuitive cognition and its object are only coexistent when the object exists actually, which, however, must not necessarily be the case. I think that it is noteworthy that the way Hurtado discusses this well-known problem, whether intuitive cognition of absent things is possible owing to divine power, seems to suggest that he is in fact more concerned with clarifying the concept of intuition than with the real issue of the limits of our cognition. His discussion of this issue aims at the meaning of the object as existent that occurs in the definition of intuitive cognition. The other important feature of the definition, that of immediacy, is questioned by two problems that, just like the previous one, still aim at sensual intuition exclusively. I will not here discuss these problems, I will just mention them. He takes them over from Molina. The first concerns the cognition of parts of wholes, whereas the second concerns cognition of objects in mirrors. And let me just say that Hurtado thinks that intuition is possible in both cases. But I have another focus in my talk. Turning explicitly to the relationship between intuitive and abstractive cognition, Hurtado reports that Gabriel Vasquez has asserted that intuitive cognition necessarily must represent all of the formalities that exist in and are identified with the object, since else we are dealing with intuitive, but rather with abstractive cognition. This should catch our attention because the view on intuition put forward by Vasquez is exactly the one that is rejected by Mastery on the grounds that it confuses intuitive with comprehensive cognition, as mentioned above. But let me now focus on Hurtado's reply. He makes the point that whatever there is of rationes that are identical with an object, they could be animal and rational in the object man, the rational animal, must be found in the representation of the object. There's no real plurality of such rationes or formalitates in the object itself. If it is the mark of any cognition, as Hurtado now says it is, to represent the rationes that are identical with its object, then there is no difference between intuitive and abstractive cognition in this regard, which is to say that the criterion for distinguishing between the two kinds of cognition cannot be whether the formalities of an object are cognized with that object or not. This issue is clearly very important to Hurtado. He not only takes it up again in the sixth disputation of his Disputationes Metaphysicae, where he discusses whether a rational distinction may come about through intuitive acts. In the 1624 edition, in contrast to all previous editions, he has also added 3 short paragraphs on the subject to our text in the Disputations on Psychology. In fact, the 1624 edition also has a lengthy digression to entire subsections on details pertaining to this issue added to the discussion in the Disputationes Metaphysicae. But let me now first focus on the addition to our text in the Disputations on Psychology. Hurtado first brings a simple argument for Vasquez's stance, which runs as follows, and that is text 5 on the handout. The quotations are not in the proper order. A cognition of something without something else is abstractive. Therefore, it is not intuitive. Therefore, an intuitive cognition must express all of the formalities of an object. Hurtado then reports that there are two opinions about a cognition that abstracts one formality from another. In fact, these two opinions lean on two different kinds of presiding act, the so-called formal and objective precisiones, which actually are just that, namely two different models of abstraction. According to the first opinion, there are not two different formalities in the object, but only different acts about one and the same object that just has different aspects or connotations, diversa connotata in obliquo. In which case, there really is no difference between intuitive and abstractive cognition in this regard, since none of them is concerned with a real plurality of formalities. And this opinion corresponds with the formal precision, which does not presuppose any plurality in the object. According to the other opinion, there are different formalities in the object, which is exactly what the presiding acts that separate these formalities reflect. Which acts, according to this opinion, may very well be acts of intuitive, non-comprehensive cognition. And this opinion then clearly operates with an objective precision, i.e. a plurality of formalities in the object itself. We know from what Hurtado said earlier that he does not think there is any plurality of formalities in the object itself. He is not a supporter of the idea of an objective precision. The formalities that our cognition of an object discerns are only different aspects or connotations. Intuitive cognition does not explicitly grasp all such formalities of an object, but rather focuses on one only, since it is only concerned with the one formality that it cognizes clearly and intuitively. This does not, however, turn intuition into true abstractive cognition. The difference between the two kinds of cognition being that intuition does not abstract from the actual existence of its object. This is one of the points that Hurtado also makes in the addition to his discussion of distinction theory in the Disputationes Metaphysicae. Where he spells this out, and this is quote 3 in the handout. Let me explain. Intuitive and abstractive science, as he now says, and not cognition, but I think he uses these terms synonymously. Intuitive and abstractive science are opposed to one another, though not in regard to the precision of formalities, therefore only in regard to the attainment of the existence of the object. Proof of the Minor regards abstractive science of possibles is not opposed to his intuition of them through abstraction of formalities. For abstractive science does not abstract from one from another, but rather attains them all, not as they are abstracted from one another, but only as abstracted from existence. Therefore, both kinds of science immediately attain all formalities, the difference being that intuitive science attains them immediately as existent, whereas abstractive science attains them by presiding all of them from existence. A printed note in the margin signalizes that here one finds an explicatio clara. But what may not be so clear is why Hurtado now speaks of cognition of all formalities, whereas he earlier spoke of the possibility of an explicit intuition of just one formality. I think that this possibility then would seem to, well, it seems to me that this possibility depends on the degree of explicitness of one's intuition, but I have not seen an explanation of this. The example with God's cognition should be understood to mean that God both has abstractive cognition of possible creatures in himself and intuitive cognition of possible creatures in themselves. Though in the above quote, in quote 3, Hurtado admits that intuitive and abstractive cognition are opposed to one another, but only in a relative sense, since they are in fact not that much opposed to one another that they cannot simultaneously take place in one intellect. In the discussion in the disputations on psychology, the same example is cited to demonstrate that there is, in this sense, in fact, no strong opposition between the two kinds of cognition. So if we turn back to the discussion of Vasquez's view on intuition in the disputations on psychology, we see that Hurtado is so concerned with rejecting this view that he also takes into account that one may understand formalitates of an object in yet one more way, not as connotations, but as of the object, but as denominations rooted in the actions of the object. This is also problematic, thinks Hurtado, and for theological reasons. He points out that the blessed in heaven do intuit God, but still they are creatures and cannot comprehend God and his free actions and infinite formalities. Quote 4 in the handout. If Vasquez believes that through an intuitive cognition is cognized the total object with all of its formalities, or rather all of its denominations that emerge from all of its effects, then his view is false, for the blessed intuit God, and yet they cannot cognize God's free actions and the infinite formalities inherent in them, because God is incomprehensible by a creature. Also, on this interpretation of formalitates, intuition and comprehension cannot be the same thing. Hurtado further says that if it indeed were the mark of intuition to grasp all of an object's formalities, then intuitive cognition would be identical with comprehensive cognition. Hurtado does admit that, I'm sorry, I lost me. I'll start this sentence from the beginning. Also on the interpretation of formalities, also on this interpretation of formalitates, intuition and comprehension cannot be the same thing. Hurtado further says that if it indeed were the mark of intuition to grasp all of an object's formalities, then intuitive cognition would be identical with comprehensive cognition. Hurtado does admit that some intuitive cognition indeed is comprehension, but not all intuitive cognition is, which would be the case if intuition is defined as a cognition that grasps all of an object's formalities. From this, Hurtado draws an important conclusion which actually only confirms the common understanding of intuitive cognition. All there is to the notion of intuition is that it, in an immediate way, is concerned with an existing object as existing. But what exactly does it mean to intuit an object as existing? To intuit exactly means to behold the thing in itself. And an intuition of an object in alio is not possible, except when speaking only loosely of intuition, as when Francisco Suarez incidentally says that God intuits free actions both immediately in themselves and mediately in his own decrees. In which case, to intuit just would mean to have a clear and distinct cognition of an existing thing without regard to whether that thing is cognized mediatedly or immediately. But if this were the true sense of to intuit, says Hurtado, we would intuit God since we cognize him as being present in his works. Clearly then, intuitive cognition is not only characterized by being about an existing object insofar as it exists, but also by grasping this object in an immediate way. Hence, it is not only true that we do not intuit a cause through its works, but neither do we intuit future events through their present causes. in the case of our human cognition, a past event can only be intuited if its species is still present in memory. It is different with divine cognition, for to God and Christ, when speaking of his infused knowledge, everything is present in all of eternity, since he, God, immediately cognizes all existing things in their own time. The point is not exactly that everything is eternally present to him, but rather that his cognition of existing things, not essences, does not abstract from their existence. And here's a quote. This is quote 6 in the handout. Cognition of future events in themselves is not abstractive. Hence, it is intuitive. For this, cognition does not abstract from the object's existence, as does cognition of an essence only. For just like essences abstract from time and existence, their cognition is called abstractive. Existence, on the other hand, does not abstract from time, and neither does its immediate cognition. Thus, rather than seeing future events as eternally present, God sees them as physically absent from eternity, in which they, as essences, do not have any temporal difference. From this consideration of intuition of past and future events springs Hurtado's definition of abstractive cognition. It is a cognition of an essence that is abstracted from existence, or a cognition of an object in something else. This definition is actually nothing else than a negation of the two main features of intuitive cognition, namely that it grasps an existing object as existing and that it does so immediately. I will now turn to Hurtado's discussion of comprehensive cognition, which primarily focuses on the issues of human persons' cognition of God and God's cognition of creatures. In fact, some later Scotist authors were reluctant to discuss comprehension in the context of philosophy, since it primarily is relevant to theology, indeed exceeds the limits of natural philosophy. But this reluctancy echoes Hurtado's own words that show that he's well aware that with this theme and the problems surrounding it, he has arrived at the border between philosophy and theology. Though, according to him, this border is not crossed. What he has to say still belongs within philosophical psychology. We will see that that is very doubtful that he is correct on this point. The general features of comprehensive cognition can be described as follows. Following an impulse from Vasquez and Augustine, Hurtado understands it as a cognition of all the formalities which are in an object, so that nothing that belongs to the object remains to be cognized. He further holds with Thomas Aquinas that something is cognized comprehensively when it is cognized the way it is cognizable. Comprehension thus corresponds with its object to the extent that in the case of comprehension there is as much cognoscibility as there is entity, meaning that as many entities and formalities are being cognized as there formally and immanently are in the object, so that nothing remains uncognized. Only in a wide sense can we say that the blessed in heaven comprehend God. But Hurtado does not think that a creature in any strict sense can be said to comprehend God. Moreover, the kind of cognition that we enjoy of God and what is formally and immanently in him, assuming that such cognition is possible, is not infinite and therefore cannot comprehend him. Suarez in his Tractatus de Anima had explicitly made the point that the blessed in heaven do have qualitative cognition of God, but they do not comprehend him. As for Hurtado himself, though the point is only expressed in the context of an argument for a competing position, it seems that he indeed thinks that only God comprehends God. In his further discussion Hurtado introduces an important supplement to the notion of comprehension, one that bestows the concept of comprehension with a causal dimension. He says that for there to be comprehension, it is required to cognize the whole object and through this all of its effects that may come forward from its nature. The claim is crucial for how we can speak of God's comprehensive cognition, both of himself and of creatures. For if comprehension implies cognition of all the effects of a cognized cause, then one may wonder whether God actually comprehends himself if he does not cognize things in himself as in their cause, in which case they are not included in the formal object of his cognition, but only in himself as their ratio formalis cognoscendi, which only bestows things with the domination to be cognized. If this is the way divine epistemology works, then God cognizes creatures without seeing their dependency on their first cause, so that in this cognition cause and effect only accompany but do not really interact with each other. If God does not cognize his effects as actually being his effects, then he cannot be said to comprehend himself. Hurtado therefore stresses the linkage between cause and effect in divine cognition. In divine cognition, the cognition of the primary object, i.e. the divine essence, must lead to cognition of the second object, i.e. creatures, which is only possible if that primary object indeed embraces the secondary object the way a formal object embraces a material one. If comprehension implies cognition of an object's effects, the next question is just how detailed must this cognition be? Does it grasp the effects in particulare or only as the Conimbricenses think, in specie? The choice is easy because if all effects are virtually or imminently contained in their cause, then without their cognizance the cause is not exhausted, which is however required for there to be comprehension in any strict sense. However, even if one distinguishes between perfect comprehension, which meets the requirement of cognizing individual effects, and imperfect comprehension, which does not, then one still must admit that also imperfect comprehension at least must present some particular knowledge of the object's effects. For instance, a horse is comprehended when one knows how fast it can run. The causal dimension of the concept of comprehension naturally also embraces the claim that for there to be comprehension is furthermore required a perfect cognition of the causes on which the object depends. Before I discuss the cognition of the effects, now Hurtado focuses on the cognition of the causes of the object. The object has a transcendental order, or as we would say, relation to its causes, and the object cannot be comprehended without clear and distinct cognition of this order, which in its turn cannot be clearly and distinctly cognized, if not the causes are clearly and distinctly cognized. The object is simply not penetrated so long the causes it depends upon are not cognized. Comprehension thus both presupposes cognition of an object's effects and of its causes. But are there any limits to the causal dimension of comprehension? Hurtado supports the view, and this is a view that he finds in Suarez, but I don't know if it's a doctrine in Suarez. He supports the view that even the most accurate cognition of a cause does not require cognition of the actual existence of its effects. When God comprehends his own essence, he does not cognize any future events as formally contained therein, which means that though their cause is cognized, the future events themselves are not. Divine comprehension of creatures is scientia simplicis intelligentiae, meaning that they are grasped only in the state of possibility. Divine comprehension of creatures is not scientia visionis, which rather is intuition of the divine causes actually existing effects. Or in other words, God's comprehension of possible creatures is simpliciter necessary, which on the contrary is not the case with any cognition of future events. Thus, Hurtado holds that a person is comprehended before he acts and even before he exists, and that this comprehension itself is not subsequently altered by that person's free acts and the ignorance of them as such. The future acts do not constitute anything uncognized in the object. They are not as such cognizable in the cause. God rather cognizes his own free acts, and with them presumably the acts of creatures, in these acts themselves and not in his essence. In accordance with this, Hurtado in his Disputationes in Deo Homine explicitly says that God's essence taken as such has no connection to creatures as existent. Regardless of this, in accordance with what we have just learned about the causal dimension of comprehension, one can also generally state that if an existing thing has necessary effects, then the effects of these, in the existence of these effects are comprehended, is comprehended with that thing. However, if the effects are not necessary, but rather are free acts, then they are not cognized with their cause, wherefore, concludes Hurtado, and thereby giving expression to the limits of this kind of cognition's causal dimension, comprehension does not require cognition of the existence of free effects, or as we may prefer to say, actions. I will now come to my conclusions. I have two conclusions. The first conclusion is that Hurtado's discussion of abstractive, intuitive, and comprehensive cognition is astonishingly theological in nature. Most of his sources in this part of his cognitive psychology are Jesuit theologians. They are Molina, Vasquez, and Suarez. Hurtado even extends his discussion of comprehension to touch upon the thorny debate on God's foreknowledge versus human persons' free acts. One easily understands why some people have reluctance to discuss such matters within philosophical psychology, which one might rather expect to keep a focus on the human soul. In Hurtado's discussion, we do not even find an explicit statement as to whether we humans enjoy any kind of intellectual intuitive cognition in this life, pro stato isto. All the examples of human intuition adduced by Hurtado being from the realm of sensual cognition. This all says quite a bit about the kind of philosophy that was put into system in Hurtado's generation, for his way of discussing abstractive, intuitive, and comprehensive cognition would hardly be appropriate within a pure commentary on Aristotle's De Anima. The detachment of philosophy from the commentary format created new possibilities for philosophical discussion, and I think that we see a very clear example of this phenomenon in the text that I have discussed. The second conclusion is the following. Besides this general remark on the Jesuit systematization of philosophy, let me add a specific note on Hurtado's influence on the cursus tradition. The point of departure of my paper was my wondering why Scotists discuss whether intuition is comprehension in their manuals and on cognitive psychology, and why they do it the way they do it. And clearly, Hurtado's decisions as to the arrangement of topics within his philosophical cursus left very concrete marks on later scholastic literature, and not only in the Jesuit tradition. This is what we see in the later Scotist discussions of psychology. But in fact, also Hurtado's decision to take up the issue of intuition and comprehension again in the context of the discussion of distinctions in his Disputationes Metaphysicae left a mark on the later tradition. Jesuits of the next generation, I have Arriaga and Oviedo in mind, proceeded in the same way. And we also see it in the vast metaphysical manuals by Zaccaria Pasqualico and Bartolomeo Mastri, and in later Scotists. Only beneath the surface there was room for fundamental discrepancies. For instance, Like Hurtado, mastery rejects Vasquez's confusion of intuition with comprehension, but whereas Hurtado makes the point that intuitive cognition cannot grasp all the formalities that are in the object because there is no such plurality in formalities ex parte re, mastery, on the contrary, defends that there is such a plurality in the object, and that the reason why intuition should not be confused with comprehension is that then intuition would not be able to discern the formalities in the object. Or in short, mastery, unlike Hurtado, is a defender of objective precisions, Scotus's formal distinction being just such an objective precision. Thank you.